The jungle pressed close on all sides, dripping with the heavy rains that had turned central Burma into a maze of mud and shadow. It was mid-May 1945, and the war in Southeast Asia was entering its final, desperate phase. Japanese forces, encircled and starving, were attempting to break through Allied lines in a series of ferocious night attacks. They had nothing left to lose. In a shallow fighting position carved into the hillside, a young soldier named Lachhiman Gurung waited in the darkness. He was 27 years old. He stood barely 4 feet 11 inches tall, shorter than regulation height, but the British Army had been accepting anyone willing to fight since the war expanded into the Pacific. Gurung had enlisted 4.5 years earlier, leaving behind a subsistence farm in the hills of Nepal to join one of the most feared infantry units in the world, the Gurkha Rifles. The Gurkhas had a reputation earned over more than a century of warfare. Recruited from the mountain villages of Nepal, these soldiers were known for an almost suicidal commitment to their mission. They carried curved knives called kukris, which they knew how to use with terrifying efficiency. British officers considered them irreplaceable. German soldiers in Europe had learned to fear them. Now, in the wet hell of Burma, the Japanese were learning the same lesson. Gurung's position was the furthest forward in the entire defensive line, a deliberately exposed post designed to give early warning of enemy movements. If the Japanese attacked, his trench would be hit first. He shared the position with 2 other riflemen. Behind them, separated by 100 yards of open ground, the rest of their company waited in reinforced positions along the ridge line. The plan was simple: delay the enemy long enough for the main force to prepare. No one expected the forward observers to survive a major assault. Intelligence reports indicated that a large Japanese force was moving through the area, perhaps 200 men or more, trying to escape the tightening Allied encirclement. They would come at night. They would come hard. They would accept massive casualties if it meant punching through to open ground. Shortly after 1 in the morning on May 13th, the attack began. Gurung heard movement in the undergrowth, rustling, whispered commands, the click of equipment. Then the first grenade came spinning out of the darkness. It landed just outside his trench. Without thinking, he scooped it up and hurled it back toward the source. The explosion briefly illuminated dozens of figures rushing forward through the trees. Another grenade landed inside the trench. Gurung grabbed it, threw it away. It detonated in midair, spraying the jungle with shrapnel. The Japanese were close now, close enough that he could hear their breathing, their boots squelching in the mud. A third grenade dropped at his feet. He reached down to throw it back. The device exploded in his right hand. The blast was overwhelming. His fingers disintegrated. Shrapnel tore through his palm, his wrist, his forearm. The concussion wave ripped into his face, destroying his right eye. Fragments embedded themselves in his chest, his legs, his neck. Burns seared across his skin. He staggered backward, blood pouring from a dozen wounds. The 2 other soldiers in the trench were hit by the same explosion, badly wounded, unable to fight. 200 Japanese soldiers were seconds away from overrunning the position. If this story has gripped you so far, please take a moment to like this video. Stories like these take days of research and careful reconstruction to bring to light. Your like tells us you want more forgotten heroes from World War II brought back into the light. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible story from the greatest generation. Any rational soldier would have retreated. The forward post was lost. Medical evacuation was the only logical course of action. Gurung was half-blind, missing most of his right hand, bleeding from catastrophic wounds. He should have been unconscious from shock. He should have been dead. Instead, he picked up his rifle. The Lee Enfield was a bolt-action weapon designed for 2-handed operation. The bolt had to be pulled back. A fresh round chambered, the bolt pushed forward and locked. It required strength, coordination, and both hands. Gurung's right hand no longer existed. He had one arm, one eye, and a rifle he had never trained to operate under these conditions. He braced the weapon against his body and worked the bolt with his left hand. He aimed with his remaining eye, and he started firing into the darkness. The Japanese had expected to find the position abandoned or defended by dying men. What they found instead was accurate, sustained rifle fire, coming from a soldier who refused to stop fighting. The lead attackers went down. The assault faltered. Confusion rippled through the Japanese ranks. Gurung kept firing. More grenades fell around him. He couldn't throw them back. His throwing arm was gone. He pressed himself against the trench wall and let the explosions wash over him, taking more shrapnel, more burns. Then he returned to his rifle and continued killing. The Japanese tried rushing the position. Gurung shot them down. They tried flanking movements. He shifted his fire, covering every approach. The jungle terrain created natural choke points, forcing the attackers into narrow corridors where Gurung's rifle could do maximum damage. Bodies began piling up in front of his trench. From his position further back, Gurung's section commander watched in disbelief. He tried to send reinforcements forward, but Japanese fire was too intense. Anyone attempting to cross that 100 yards of open ground would be cut to pieces. So Gurung fought alone. One man against 200, wounded beyond what should be survivable, operating a weapon he could barely hold. The physical demands were staggering. The rifle weighed 9 pounds. Cycling the bolt one-handed while maintaining aim required strength and coordination Gurung was inventing in real time. Pain from his injuries must have been excruciating. The destroyed hand, the ruined eye, the embedded shrapnel, the burns. Blood loss alone should have rendered him unconscious, but Gurung stayed on his feet through sheer force of will. His job was to hold the position. Everything else, including his own survival, was secondary. The Japanese couldn't understand what was happening. They had overwhelming numerical superiority. They had momentum and surprise, and they were being stopped by a single defender who should have been dead 10 times over. Officers rallied their men for renewed assaults. Every attack met the same result: rifle fire, casualties, retreat. Gurung fired until his rifle was empty, then reloaded one-handed, a process that normally required both hands and took seconds. One-handed in pitch darkness, while bleeding and half-blind, it took much longer. Every moment of reloading was a moment the Japanese could advance. Gurung learned to reload faster, fumbling cartridges by feel, getting the weapon back into action, resuming fire. He repeated this process hundreds of times through the night. Time lost meaning. The battle became a continuous roar punctuated by muzzle flashes and explosions. Gurung operated on pure training and instinct. Aim, fire, cycle bolt, aim, fire. His body executed the movements without conscious thought. His ammunition dwindled. He had no idea how many rounds remained. He simply fired until the rifle was empty, reloaded, and fired again. Around 4 a.m, the Japanese attacks began losing momentum. Too many casualties, too many bodies in front of that cursed trench, too much fear of the unseen soldier who wouldn't die. The assault waves became less frequent, less coordinated. The attackers were breaking. Gurung used the lull to assess his condition. He was barely conscious. Blood loss and shock were overwhelming his body. His destroyed hand hung useless. Shrapnel wounds covered him. He felt for ammunition in his pouches, almost none left. Maybe enough for one more attack, maybe not. He didn't think about medical care or evacuation. He watched the darkness and waited for the next assault, rifle ready. As dawn approached, the Japanese attempted one final push. This was desperation. They needed to break through before daylight exposed them to Allied aircraft. They gathered their remaining strength and charged Gurung's position one last time, accepting that many would die, betting that sheer numbers would finally overwhelm the lone defender. Gurung met them with his last rounds. He fired until the magazine was empty. Then he placed his hand on his kukri knife. If they reached his trench, he would fight with steel, one-handed, half-blind, bleeding out. He would use the blade until they killed him, or he killed them all. But the final assault broke before reaching his position. The charge faltered. Attackers fell. Dawn was breaking and the survivors melted back into the jungle rather than be caught in the open by daylight. The assault was over. When Gurung's comrades reached his trench at first light, they expected to find him dead. No one could survive that long under such conditions, but Lachhiman Gurung was alive, barely. He sat surrounded by spent shell casings, his rifle across his knees, his kukri within reach. His right hand was gone, his right eye was destroyed. Blood covered everything, but he was conscious, still watching the jungle, still ready to fight if the Japanese returned. They pulled him from the trench and began emergency treatment. The damage was catastrophic. His hand required amputation. His eye was permanently lost. Shrapnel had to be extracted from throughout his body, but he had survived and his trench had held. The Japanese had failed to break through. The entire company position remained intact because one undersized rifleman from Nepal had refused to let the enemy pass. While Gurung was being evacuated for surgery, other soldiers examined the ground around his position. They counted 31 confirmed Japanese dead, all within a few yards of his trench. 31 soldiers killed by one man with one hand in 4 hours of continuous combat. Blood trails and scattered equipment indicated many more wounded who had been dragged away. Gurung had single-handedly stopped an assault by more than 200 men. 31 enemy soldiers killed by one man with one hand. Take a moment to let that sink in. If this story is moving you, we'd be honored if you'd share this video with someone who needs to hear about real courage. Stories like Lachhiman Gurung's deserve to be remembered and spread. Use the share button and help us honor these forgotten heroes. The recommendation for Britain's highest military decoration was immediate. His section commander wrote a detailed account of what he had witnessed. The report moved up the chain of command with unusual speed. This was an action that defined heroism. One soldier holding an impossible position against overwhelming odds, fighting despite wounds that should have killed him, saving his unit through raw courage and skill. The Victoria Cross was approved and announced in August 1945, just days before Japan surrendered. The citation described Gurung's action in formal military language, but the words couldn't capture the full horror of what he had endured. 4 hours alone, bleeding, half-blind, in agony. Fighting an enemy that outnumbered him 50-1. No support, no reinforcement, no retreat. Just duty. Gurung recovered in military hospitals. The war ended while he was still being treated. He would never fight again. His combat days were finished. But he returned to Nepal as a living legend, carrying the Victoria Cross, one of only 13 Gurkhas ever to receive it. Life after the war was difficult. Farming with one hand was nearly impossible. The British government provided a small pension for Victoria Cross recipients, but it wasn't much. Gurung struggled financially for years. He married, raised children, tried to build an ordinary life. But he was famous throughout Nepal, the one-handed Gurkha who had killed 31 enemy soldiers. People treated him with immense respect. His story was taught in schools. 50 years later, in 1995, Gurung was invited to London for Victoria Cross commemorations. He travelled to Britain, met with other recipients, was honoured by Queen Elizabeth II. People wanted to understand how he had accomplished what he did. Gurung's answers were always simple. I was a Gurkha. I had my duty. I did what was necessary. He spent his final years advocating for better treatment of aging Gurkha veterans, reminding people that soldiers from Nepal had served Britain faithfully for generations and deserved proper support. His voice carried weight. He was a living legend, someone who had proven courage beyond any question. Lachhiman Gurung died in December 2010 at age 92. His death was mourned across Nepal and Britain. Military units honored his memory. His Victoria Cross was preserved. And his story was told again, how one rifleman had done what should have been impossible, how courage and duty had overcome injury and odds, how a Gurkha had shown the world what better to die than be a coward actually meant. The Gurkha regiment still teaches story to every new recruit. Young soldiers learn about Lachhiman Gurung the same way Gurung learned about heroes from earlier generations. The cycle continues. The Gurkha Museum displays his citation and photographs so visitors can understand what he accomplished on that night in May 1945. But perhaps the most important legacy is what his story represents. Gurung was not superhuman. He was undersized in a military that preferred taller soldiers. He came from a poor farming family. He had no special advantages, no elite training, no advanced weapons. What he had was duty, courage, and the refusal to quit when every instinct told him to run. The Japanese soldiers who attacked his position were experienced fighters who had conquered much of Asia. They fought with determination and had every tactical advantage, except one. They encountered a Gurkha who refused to let them pass, refused to die, refused to fail his duty. 200 men stopped by one wounded soldier who simply would not quit. Modern military academies study Gurung's action, trying to understand the psychology behind it. The truth is simpler than the analysis. Gurung was trained, brave, and committed to protecting his brothers in arms. When the moment came, he did what Gurkhas have always done. He fought. He didn't calculate odds or consider alternatives. He had a job, hold the trench. He held it. Everything else was irrelevant. The physical challenges alone should have stopped him. Operating a bolt-action rifle one-handed is nearly impossible. Aiming accurately with one eye in darkness defies expectations. Staying conscious with massive blood loss and catastrophic trauma goes against all medical understanding. Gurung did all of it, not because he was invulnerable, but because he accepted no alternative. There's a temptation to view such actions as impossible feats that ordinary soldiers couldn't replicate. But Gurung would reject that interpretation. He considered himself an ordinary Gurkha doing his duty. Nothing special, nothing superhuman. His message was clear. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but fighting despite it. Duty isn't following orders when it's easy, but doing your job when it seems impossible. Honor isn't winning, it's refusing to lose. The trench where Lachhiman Gurung made his stand no longer exists. The Burmese jungle has reclaimed that hillside. The physical battlefield is gone, eroded by time and weather. But the story remains, passed down through Gurkha regiments, taught to new soldiers, remembered by historians, celebrated by Nepal and Britain alike. 31 enemy dead. 4 hours of hell. One hand, one eye, one Gurkha who simply would not die. When people ask how he did it, the answer is both simple and profound. He was a Gurkha. Better to die than be a coward. On May 13, 1945, Lachhiman Gurung proved that saying wasn't just words. It was reality. It was duty. It was who he was. The Japanese learned that lesson the hardest way possible, and the world learned what one man with one hand could accomplish when he refused to quit. We want to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from, your country and city. Have you heard stories like this from your own family? Did a father or grandfather serve in World War II? Do you know someone who fought alongside Gurkha soldiers? Share your memories and thoughts below. And if you believe stories like Lachhiman Gurung's deserve to be remembered, hit that like button one more time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Heroes like this deserve more than a footnote in history. They deserve to be honored as the warriors they were.